Hey, and thank you for joining for this episode 4 of jQuery 1.4 Hotness. Today we're going to be talking about some of the things related to traversing, manipulation, Ajax that we're seeing in 1.4. So let's get into it. We're going to start off with has. So the has method is brand new in 1.4. And it works actually just like the filter, the selector filter. Here we go. So this is what we've been doing for a while, and this has been working for a few versions now. You can just use the has selector right in there inside your selector string. But in 1.4, we can basically use has here. So I'm just going to actually make this a little bit more equivalent. Start off with my li selection, has a, and add class. And the trick here is that it's actually adding the class to LIs. It's not like traversing really. It's purely a filter method, like not or like filter. So basically, here's the equivalent, which is I'm going to take the LIs, I'm going to run a filter function on them, and then return all the LIs that have an A inside of them. So that's really all that has is doing. So it's just a really handy way to filter the element set that you're currently holding. EQ had some changes. So you can use negative indices when you pass them in. So if you're holding a bunch of elements and you pass the EQ in -1, it's going to pull the last element of that set and return it to you. So also I want to point out that the get method, which gets the native DOM element traditionally inside the jQuery object, also now accepts negative indices. And then we have the addition of the first and last methods. So before we might have used the first pseudo selector inside a selector string, and now we can actually just call the first filter. I want to point out that this is exactly equivalent to EQ0. And same thing with the last method, exactly equivalent to EQ -1. Also, from a performance standpoint, it will be a little bit faster to be using first or EQ or last versus doing it inside of the selector string. A little bit faster. Untils. So I think everyone's run into this problem, which is you're holding an element. You want to grab all the subsequent elements, like its siblings that are following, but up to a certain point. So this is what the until methods support, and there's 3 of them. The first one is next until. So a common use case for this is something like you have a definition list, and for each definition term and definition, there can be multiple. So for each term, I could have 3 definitions. So for instance, I would bind a click handler to the definition term, and from there, I would traverse to up until the next definition term that I find. So the first parameter is what I'm going to stop at. And the second parameter is the selector of the elements I want to include. This option is completely optional argument. So this would essentially be equivalent to a universal selector. I just want to select everything in between here and there. This is, I guess, an exclusive filter, right? It will not include this DT. It will include the next DT. It'll just include all the DDs. So preventil works similarly. I'm going to start off with a bind a click event to these mark as read links. And inside here, I'm going to traverse up to the closest paragraph tag, and then move up there, selecting all the paragraphs tags between here and the last one that we've classed as read. Then we're going to mark all these new ones as read. This is someone just saying I've read up to this point, essentially. And then I'm going to use a map function and return all the IDs that relate to these paragraph tags that are now read. And this will return itself as an array into read IDs. And now I'm going to post this read IDs to some Ajax thing, so that now my backend knows what paragraphs have been read by the user. So we have a little bit more power in our traversal. Parents until, similar. We're just going to traverse up the parent chain up until we hit a certain selector. When we click on this explode link, we're going to traverse up until we hit this container, and then we're going to set them all to position absolute, and then animate the top and left in some random fashion, and it's all just going to explode, I think. I haven't tested it, but I'm pretty sure it'll explode. Okay. So add has a new modification now. You can pass the second parameter to add will be a context. And that might not first sound very useful, but what is really great is when you want to do a big long chain. So here we're going to load some new content, our new mail, into our inbox. Inside the callback, we're going to grab all the titles inside our response, right? And apply some sort of hover function tooltip thing to them. And then we're also going to add in all the from fields inside this response, and then apply a click handler. So this click handler is going to apply to both the froms and the titles. So that's add with a context, new in 1.4. Unwrap is brand new in 1.4. And it's basically the inverse of the wrap method, which we've had for quite a bit. So let me uncomment this HTML so it's a little bit easier to see. So if we just have a basic structure like this, inside this div is 3 different p tags. And if I just call unwrap down here on the div, it basically just, these p tags basically shed their skin, you know? So what you end up with is no more div, and the p tags have basically taken that parent position within the DOM, which is very useful. I've seen people do this before using things like HTML, and you can lose event handlers. So this is a very nice DOM oriented way of doing this sort of manipulation. All right, we got some new enhancements to Ajax, or Ajax, as I like to say. One of the first things is the content type will basically be sent in the request header of all outgoing Ajax requests. And this allows backends to determine, to use that content type to say, okay, I'll send you back JSON, or I'll send you back XML. Before that was not always sent. Similarly, in a response header, when it comes back, if you've not specified a data type using for instance, the Ajax method, you haven't said what data type it is, but the response comes back with a content type of application JSON, it will be parsed as JSON. Similarly, application JavaScript will be executed as script. So that's new functionality. Also, the success callback for any Ajax method will now get an additional third parameter passed in. So the success callback usually gets the data as the first argument and the text status. And now we have the XHR object, the XML HTTP request object. This is new. The previous way of doing this was basically, would be that the XHR object was returned from all of these, and you would be using that inside the callback. But now we get it passed directly right into success, which is much more handy. JSON-P, also known as JSON with padding for some weird reason. It's a bad name. It's okay. It's a little bit nicer to deal with in common cases. So you can actually specify the name of the callback that you want to use. Previous to 1.4, that was really just not intuitive whatsoever. Now they make it really easy. So I'm going to set up this callback called _callback, which is just going to console log out whatever gets passed into it. And so in my call, I'm going to call something on Yahoo Pipes, and I specify the data type is JSONP, and I say that I want the JSONP callback to be my global function that I already have defined, instead of passing in, for instance, an anonymous function here. Instead, I want to use something that I already have defined in my structure. All right. The other thing that we have in Ajax is explicit JSON parsing. And this is a result of, I guess the feature really is that we're using the native JSON parsing that's available in IE8, Firefox 3.5, and we have it in V8 and Chrome, and it's in WebKit, I believe, as well. And the big difference is that it parses JSON with a lot more rigidity. It has a lot more constraints around what the JSON can actually look like. So whereas this response right here, if you had been returning this JSON before, it would have worked in previous versions. These keys are not quoted, but they need to be. So you need to have double quotes. You can't be passing functions. Double quotes. So this would have been working before. It will now be, an error will be thrown. The other nice thing is that for browsers that don't have native JSON parsing, there will be a test done to filter out any of these things we need to watch for, so that the fallback method is as explicit as the native. While we're talking about Ajax, I'm going to talk about param. The param method is used by serialize. So the change here is that if you're using deep objects and they're serialized, previously they didn't really represent the correct serialization. So the change made is a lot more friendly to frameworks like PHP and Ruby on Rails. So previously, if we had been parameterizing an object that contained an array here, the response would look something like this. But the correct response is now what we're going to see in 1.4. This is also a flag that you can set if you want to return back to how it was. You just say jQuery Ajax options traditional equals true, and you'll be getting the same behavior that we saw in 1.32 and earlier. I also want to point out that HTML5 input elements, input types, such as input type datetime, input type color, the new ones that we're starting to see support for in browsers, those will be serialized now as well when you just call serialize on a form. Okay, and I think that does it for this episode. So thank you for joining us.